Okay, this is the Digestive System 1 lecture. Just talking a little about some of the basics of the digestive system, the gastrointestinal system, and we'll be subsequently going into a second lecture or a second PowerPoint video talking about the upper portion of the GI system and then lower portion and so forth. I think overall we have like 4 videos that we'll have for this, but they're broken down to smaller pieces. So let's talk about just a general operation of the digestive system, the gastrointestinal system. The whole idea behind the GI system is we need to eat food to be able to provide nutrients, to be able to work as fuels to make things work. Okay, so basically we all start out with ingesting food, taking something in. But then you know what? If you took some blood, you wouldn't be able to look at the blood underneath the microscope and see a little Big Mac floating around. It has to be broken down. We have to take that food that we ingest in our digestive system and break it down into small molecular enough sized particles that will actually be able to get through the wall of the intestine to be able to enter the bloodstream, to be able to take to various areas of the body to be able to use for nutrients. Okay, and there's lots of different ways that are involved in how we break things down, how we get them to molecular sized bites. Okay, but the whole process is, and we'll be talking about that over the next couple of videos, the whole process is to bring this food in and take a large mass of something and in some way break it down to its bare minimum parts, down to a molecular size where the molecular size is small enough that I could get it through the wall of the intestine, and then inside the wall of the intestine have these little blood vessels, these little capillaries that will be able to take the nutrients and have those nutrients put around. Well, the first process that we have to talk about with the digestive system is digestion, and digestion just involves breaking these things down. It doesn't mean using them or anything like that, but just breaking these materials, the food material, down so I could eventually use those for some type of an energy source. Now, what are these food categories? Well, obviously we have a lot of different things, and you know what? We always talk about a balanced diet, and everybody gets on these fad diets, you know, the keto diet and all kinds of other things by using a lot of fats and stuff like that. Everybody talks about a lot of different diets, but the whole fact of the matter is that we actually need a relatively balanced diet. We need something of everything, simply because we can't live on one thing alone. We need a lot of things. We need carbohydrates because they are usually a pretty good energy source in regards to their clean burning fuels. When I break down all the carbohydrates, the byproducts and the waste products are very simple and easy to get rid of. Okay, and basically when you talk about carbohydrates, you're talking about starches, glycogen, polysaccharides, sugars, and stuff like that we're able to, again, get down to small enough molecular size, because the sizes are relatively small, and to be able to use those, but they're clean burning fuels. And glycogen just is largely a storage form of a starch, where I've taken a lot of glucose. I can't store glucose per se, but they could take the glucose and combine it. They could mix it up to make a long chain that's called glycogen, and the glycogen now could be stored in places like skeletal muscle and in the liver, so that when I need it for a rainy day, I could actually extract it from the skeletal muscle. I could extract it from the liver, break it down to small starchy particles, glucose particles, and be able to use those as fuels down the road. So we do need carbohydrates, and the majority of our diet is taken up in carbohydrates. Okay, fats. We do need fats, which are lipids, various triglycerides, cholesterol. We do need these things. So everybody talks about limiting. Yeah, we do, and we try to limit certain types of fats which can have detrimental effects. But we do need fats, because what happens is sometimes to make fats, I need fats to be able to make fats, and some things in the body are fatty, such as certain types of some of the steroids that the body makes have a fatty base to them. So I do need something to be able to create this. Also, for the replacement of cell membranes and things like that, guess what? Remember, talking about a lipid bilayer, not a carbohydrate bilayer, but a lipid bilayer. So I need lipids in some way in my diet. So you do need a certain percentage of that. And we also need proteins. And proteins are important because what is a protein? First of all, they're polypeptides. Well, that doesn't give me any more of an answer. What polypeptides, proteins are, is they're actually larger molecules, very large molecules that are basically a bunch of amino acids and other things put together, but they have an amino acid backbone. They're made of amino acids. Now, these amino acids can be important for a number of different processes, and also to replace a lot of the tissue in my body, which are proteins. So I need to have this amino acid pool in my body from the food that I eat, okay, to be able to dip into that pool to make that. We talked about using amino acids in regards to how our genetic code dictates for how we make proteins. Okay, people say it's blue eyes, blonde hair, whatever the case may be. But actually, it's how we make proteins, and these proteins, the code for making the proteins is in my DNA. Okay, so therefore I do need these polypeptides, I do need these proteins to be able to create an amino acid pool to make other proteins for body repair and things like that. So we need all these things, the carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins, as a balanced diet. Typical example, when you look at the some of the kids in like some third world famine countries, in various places in Africa and stuff like that, what happens, famine has produced that the fact that they could that they really aren't able to farm, they aren't able to do much, and then cattle is limited for things like milk and stuff like that. So what happens is they have food drops. What do they drop for food? They drop things like rice, things that they could put in bulk, but most of the things that they drop are for calories, and we get most of our calories from carbohydrates. Even though it's true that fats actually provide more energy per unit volume than carbohydrates, but carbohydrates provide most of the calories that I need to be able to burn calories to be able when I make energy. Okay, well, what happens? They drop all the carbohydrates like this which are starches like in rice. So these kids have a diet that's like almost 100% rice. Well, to make protein, I need protein. Well, what's one of those important proteins? Albumin. Albumin is an exceptionally important protein. It's in our blood. It's in the liquid portion of our blood, and what it does, it keeps the water in our blood. Okay, as a result, what happens is when my albumin levels go down, what happens is we see these kids, their ankles start to swell, and we also see these huge bellies. Now, the huge bellies aren't a lot of fat. All that is fluid. Why? Because my albumin levels on these kids the albumin levels on the kids are so low that it doesn't keep the fluid inside the vessels, and the fluid leaks out. Where does it leak out? Through that peritoneal membrane and fills the abdominal cavity. So this is all what's called ascites, ascites fluid that fills that abdominal cavity, that creates this large belly. Stick a needle in there, you suck it out, it's a lot of fluid. It's going to come back because, again, if they don't have the proteins to make proteins such as albumin, which you need to be able to control blood pressure, to control other things like that, to keep the fluid in the blood, guess what? You're up a creek. So anyway, we need all these things in some type of a balanced form to be able to have a normal, typical diet. Okay. Now, what controls our digestive system? Now, we talked about this a little bit before. We talked a lot about it before, in fact, when we talked about the nervous system. That when we talked about most things that most part of the nervous system that makes automatic things run through the autonomic nervous system are controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. However, not the digestive system. The coordination, the movement of food through the digestive tract, as well as the sequential secretion of enzymes and other materials that assist in digestion, are largely under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system. We talked about that great old vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, as we all know, starts at the base of the brain, comes out through that jugular foramen, comes straight down, and goes everywhere. It goes to the throat, because we talked about that with gag and with swallowing. We talked about how it goes to the esophagus, it goes to the lungs, it goes to the heart. We talked about how the vagus nerve slows the heart down parasympathetically. It holds the heart rate back a little bit, because I know my inherent rate of the heart, if you remember, is usually from the SA nodes between 80 to 100, but that parasympathetic control gets it down to closer to between 60 to 80, 85, in that range, by pulling back the reins a little bit on that. So, and then the parasympathetic system then goes to the stomach. When the parasympathetic system, we'll talk about this in regards to various phases of digestion. When the parasympathetic nervous system goes to the stomach, there are certain cells in the stomach called parietal cells. What do these parietal cells do? They secrete acid. So what happens is the acid secretion, which helps in digestion, is stimulated by the vagus nerve. Stimulus would come from smell, sight, and stuff like that of food, taste of food, stimulates the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve stimulates the parietal cells. The parietal cells secrete acid in the stomach to help in digestion. So, and as well as they also go to various nerves in the walls of the GI tract to keep things moving. This is called peristalsis. When we have these contractions throughout the GI tract, those gurgles that you hear, the contraction of the GI tract is there stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system that will move things through this long tube, because it's not always going directly down, but sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes to the side and stuff like that. So we have the sympathetic nervous system that controls, a lot of the secretions of things, as well as the sensory neurons that will have the muscular activity of the intestines that will move things along, various other local digestive reflexes and things like that. And we have also sensory receptors in the digestive walls. When people have gas pain, why do you think you have gas pain? Because what happens is gas will develop inside the wall of the intestine, and what happens, it blows it up, it stretches it out a little bit, and because that stretch, the sensory receptors in the wall of the intestine perceive that pain goes up, and therefore we know we have that type of a pain. Or cramping and stuff like that. A lot of that has to do with the sensory receptors that are in the digestive tract wall, which basically are going to stimulate and tell my brain that there's something that's wrong there. We also have a lot of hormonal regulation. Okay, there are a number of hormones that are really important in regards to making things work. Okay, with this parasympathetic nervous system, it works hand in hand with a number of different hormones that are secreted by various organs. Some of the hormones that we'll be talking about, I think, are gastrin, gastric inhibitory peptide, secretin, cholecystokinin. That's even beside things that are produced from the pancreas, such as insulin, which lowers blood sugar, and glucagon, which raises blood sugar. There are tons of hormones. At least 18 hormones are involved in the digestive system. We'll talk about a few of them. We won't talk about a whole lot, but we'll talk about some of them that are very important in regards to making things work. So it's a combination of both hormonal response as well as neurological response to keep my digestive system moving and heading in the right direction. Okay. Now, when we look at the digestive mechanism, there's three processes that are involved, okay? And I have to be able, like an assembly line. If you've ever worked in a place where you had like a conveyor belt, an assembly line, what happens is things go down the assembly line and things are put in, or things are done at each various station. Or let's go back to your lab practical when we had stations and we went around the area and stations and stuff like that. Well, in lab practicals like that, what happens is each station something different happens, okay? The same thing happens with my digestive mechanism. We eat the food, okay, and then we have to move that food along this digestive tract, and it's by what we call peristalsis. Peristalsis is an important word, and what happens is these contractions, these waves that will squeeze concentrically, and they like milking all the way down the chain. What does it? Pushes things throughout this GI system, which is making all these twists and turns. Okay, so I need to have movement of that material down the GI tract. One of the problems sometimes it develops is like after abdominal injury or infections in the abdomen or after anesthesia, the nerve supply to the intestines stops. Okay, and what happens is the peristalsis stops. What happens is then all the fluid that's in the intestine just sits there. It doesn't go anywhere. So that's why after surgery, they wait for a while to feed you. Why? Because the anesthesia temporarily paralyzes the motor activity, the sensory nerve impulse that impulses to the intestines that's creating the peristalsis. If they feed you, everything builds up. Eventually what's going to happen is it's going to all come out and it's going to be vomited out because it backs up. Okay, so they have to wait until either you feel hungry and you start to feel growls in your belly, they can actually hear bowel sounds, or you start passing gas. And if any of those three things happen, they know that the GI system is back up and running again. Those nerves are working again, and go ahead and feed them. But what happens is, besides moving things down, I have to get things changed. The first thing is digestion, and that's again what we talked about before. You have to take the food and you have to break it down both mechanically and chemically into small, usable, molecular-sized packets that could get through the wall of the intestine. And that's not an easy thing. Some things are really easy to digest, and other things are a bear. And some things will never get digested. Think about it. Just about to think about the last time you had this, corn. What happened with corn? Sometimes you saw it on your plate, and sometimes you saw it somewhere else later on. Okay, and the reason why is the corn, the husk on the corn, the cellulose in each corn, sometimes is very difficult to digest. So some things don't digest well. They aren't broken down well by various enzymes or acids into usable packets where they could be absorbed through the wall of the gut. With all the fecal material, basically what it is, it's a conglomeration of what the body didn't want. Okay, it's nothing that's really eliminated from the blood that's getting in there. It's basically what I could not put into small enough packets enough to be able to absorb. Okay, so you have to, or the things that aren't well absorbed, and all the waste products, everything that's left after you've absorbed and after you've digested everything and absorbed it, whatever's left, there you go, that's it. Okay, that's what ends up being eliminated in the south end. Okay, so digestion is breaking things down into both by mechanical means, such as chewing, as well as churning. Some of this muscular activity that we get in the stomach and in the intestine actually churns things. We'll squeeze, sort of like kneading bread, you know, and stuff like that, to be able to help to break it down as well. Finally, when I get it broken down, either by chemical means or by mechanical means, it gets down to molecular sized particles. And these molecular sized particles have to be small enough to be able to pass through the wall of the intestine, the mucosa. The mucosa is that inside membrane on the inside of the intestine, okay, and into the area of the blood or the lymphatic structures that are in these little things. Now, if you remember when we looked at the microscope earlier in the year, okay, or if this is somebody in years down the road that's looking at this video and they didn't look at the microscope, we looked at the jejunum and other parts of the intestine. You saw these little fingers, and those little fingers were called villi. And up the center of the villi are little small capillaries. And the capillaries, as we've learned from the cardiovascular system, are where we bring things in and it's their exchange vessels. So when things are broken down to molecular walls, they have to get through the wall of the intestine. Now the villi, these small little fingers that we have that are lining the whole small intestine and most of the large intestine, what happens is these little villi increase the surface area, which means I could absorb more. In other words, if it was a flat surface, I'd absorb less. But by taking that flat surface and putting all these folds in it, okay, all these little fingers, it increases the overall surface area, which makes more areas to be able to absorb, okay? So I have to get it passed through that mucosa, which lines the inside of the intestine, through that wall, and then inside the capillary. Also, there are little lymphatic channels called lacteals that run up through these little fingers as well. They will absorb certain things like fats. And now, where do the lymphatic things they do? They dump it in the area of the jugular vein. Okay, and dump all these fats for the lymphatics into the circulation, my venous circulation around in the jugular vein, okay, or sometime in the abdomen. So they have to be small enough particles to be able to get through the wall so that I could get it into the circulation or in the lacteals so I could use it for energy in other places in the body, so they can be picked up by the circulatory system and transported. Okay, the final process that we have in the digestive mechanism is defecation or elimination, and basically, like I mentioned before, is basically stuff that was non-digestible waste material, stuff that we can't use. You know, it's refuge. It's the stuff that we ate the day before or whatever the case may be, but guess what? That was part that we didn't want to use, that we didn't want to absorb, that couldn't be absorbed, and eventually eliminated. Okay, it's not like in the kidneys where we have waste materials that are made in the cells and we dump it into the urine. It's not like that at all. It's only what we can't digest and what we can't absorb is left, and that's what we have with defecation. So that's the three different processes: digestion, absorption, and defecation in my GI system. Okay, now what do we think when we talk about digestion? Let's focus on that a little bit more. Digestion could be a number of different ways. Like I said, it could be mechanical. When we, you ever hear, chew your food? You know, and the idea is it'll help with your digestion. Yes, it will. So the teeth and the tongue are important in regards to my first form of digestion, because what happens, it takes a bulk material and it crushes it down and grinds it and shears it together so it comes into smaller pieces. Okay, it's sort of like taking a large solid piece of thing and then breaking it down even more. So the more you chew your food, the more your mouth prepares it so that the enzymes and acids that we have in other areas could break it down even more. In other words, if it's a big chunk, it's going to take a longer time to get rid of that. But if I chew it, guess what? It's going to be easier to be able to get to those inner areas of all that stuff that has to be done there. So the teeth and the tongue are important. The teeth in regards to incising with the front teeth, ripping with the canines, and crushing with the molars in the back. Okay, and then the tongue. Once I get this all crushed up and eaten and mushed up in my mouth, then what happens is the saliva from the salivary glands, the parotid, the sublingual, and the submandibular glands, they will secrete this fluid that moistens it. It creates like a dough ball. Okay, it makes like a ball of the material that I've chewed. and then my tongue will push it to the back of my throat, which stimulates cranial nerve 9 and 10. I love it when a plant comes together, takes cranial nerve 9 and 10, puts them together, which causes that swallowing, causes the soft palate to rise, and then it causes some various muscles in the back of the pharynx to be able to constrict, to be able to start to push things down past the esophagus. Wow, it all comes together in the end. That's why all these things, one thing feeds upon the other. They all interdigitate with each other, okay? And then finally, we also get, as we go through the area of the stomach and intestine, these mechanical motions. The stomach actually has about 4 layers of muscle, and all the muscles are lined up in different directions. So when they fire, they're all working against each other. But when they work against each other, it's like a bunch of fingers that are working in all kinds of different directions. And that's what the stomach does. It's able to like churn or able to knead all the stuff that's in the stomach, so it mixes up like a good old milkshake in there. So I have churning and swirling in the stomach and intestines just by mechanical activity of the muscles in the wall of those organs, okay? We have chemical digestion. Chemical digestion just allows a better absorption because now I'm able to break things down. This is by various things like various enzymes and acids. If we think about the stomach has a lot of hydrochloric acid. What does the hydrochloric acid do? It breaks things down to small enough particles, okay? Number of enzymes. The pancreas puts out things like amylase. Also the parotid puts out amylase. I forgot to mention that. But the pancreas puts out amylase. Amylase, A-S-E at the end of the word, usually means an enzyme. Amylase starts to break down starches, okay? Also makes lipase. Lipase breaks down, obviously, fats. So we have those things. Acids. There's a number of different enzymes that are actually squirted in at various areas along that GI tract that will help to break things down and mush them up to make them much more molecular size to aid absorption, okay? And those are a bunch of enzymes, various enzymes, as well as acids. Like I said, there's a whole list of those, okay? And then finally, at the end, after the digestive, there's stuff that's just not going to be digested. Stuff that that the human body has not been made to be able to digest well. Sometimes, like, and you see sort of like shells on seeds, husks on corn, stuff like that. All these things are things that are made sort of like a cellulose, that really don't get absorbed very well. They're very fibrous. That's why I talk about eating fiber. When you eat fiber, it adds bulk to your stool. Why? Because those are things that can't be absorbed, and as a result, they give bulk to the stool, which seems to improve bowel function, as well as some people thought it might be helpful in regards to decreasing the incidence of like things like colon cancer and stuff like that. So that's the digestive mechanism. When we talk about the whole system, okay, the system has a number of different structures to it, and there we go. And what happens is we have what are called the main structures of the GI tract. The main structures are including like the mouth, the pharynx, which is the throat, okay, the esophagus, which is basically, esophagus, long word, sounds important. Basically, it's a tube to get the stuff from the mouth to the stomach. That's about it. Not much else happens in the esophagus. The stomach, a lot happens in the stomach. A lot of the stuff that's in there stays in the stomach for a long time to try to get it ready. The small intestine. Small intestine is where most of the nutrient absorption occurs, particularly the last half of the small intestine. And then the large intestine. Well, what happens to the large intestine? The large intestine, most of the nutrients, by the time they get to the large intestine, have been removed, okay, have been out. They got out in the small intestine. What the large intestine largely is responsible for is removing most of the water. By the time all the material leaves the small intestine and gets dumped into the large intestine, mostly it's soup. Very soupy. So as a result, as that material is sloshing its way through the large intestine, what does the large intestine do? It sucks the water out of it. So therefore, it provides more formed bowel movements as compared to much more liquidy, watery, diarrheal type bowel movements, okay? So these are the main structures. We also have accessory structures of the GI tract. The teeth, because they do help to grind things out. The tongue, because it pushes things to the back. Salivary glands, because it makes a moist dough ball that makes it easier to swallow. But we also have things like the liver. Liver is important because remember when we talked about bile, okay? Bile is important. We've mentioned this a couple times, maybe remotely in the past. Bile is actually from dead and dying red blood cells. The spleen, which is another organ here in the secondary, the spleen takes these dead and dying red blood cells, because red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They can't really divide. Okay, a red blood cell can't divide. So as a result, once I get to that red blood cell portion, it can't divide. It lasts about 120 days. What happens is the spleen then picks up all these dead and dying red blood cells and breaks them down and recycles the iron, because the iron is what actually carries the oxygen in a molecule that's jam-packed. The reason why they take the nucleus out of a red blood cell is they can put more of something called hemoglobin, which is a protein, into the red blood cell, because hemoglobin is what carried oxygen. So red blood cells are basically transport vehicles. That's all they are. No brains, transport vehicles. They just they're for transporting oxygen. And so they have lots of this molecule inside the red blood cell called hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin in each corner of this hemoglobin square molecule are iron. Okay, it's an iron, so there's 4 iron molecules in the hemoglobin, and what happens is at that point the iron binds the oxygen and carries it around. So once we have the spleen that takes the old dead and dying red blood cells, it takes the iron and recycles it. It's hard to get rid of iron. The body has a real difficult time getting rid of iron, okay? But it takes the iron and recycles it, and takes the protein, the rest of the hemoglobin, because hemoglobin's a protein, and busts it up, and then sends it to the liver, and the liver makes something called bilirubin. And the bilirubin then is transformed by adding cholesterol and a couple things to something called bile, and bile then is stored in the gallbladder. And in the gallbladder, the bile is there, and what happens is the gallbladder is stuck to the bottom side of the liver. I'll explain how that happens in a little bit later, but it's stuck to the bottom side of the liver, and when I have a fatty meal, the bile will squeezes out bile from the gallbladder into the first portion of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum, and bile helps to emulsify fats. Okay, the liver does a lot of other things too. The liver takes all the nutrients. We'll talk about the portal vein a little bit later when we get to that. We talked about that in the cardiovascular lecture, the importance of the portal vein, because all the nutrients that are absorbed in the small intestine. First stop on the train, liver. Liver takes whatever it needs to make things, such as albumin. I talked about albumin before. The only spot, or the prime, there might be some other places, but the only place that really functionally makes albumin in the body is the liver. So the liver is really important. People with liver failure, what happens is their blood pressure, they can't control their blood pressure. Why? Because they don't make the albumin, doesn't let the water stay in with the fluid. The volume in the vessels goes down, therefore there's not enough pressure in the system. So the gallbladder and the liver are accessory organs, as well as the pancreas. The pancreas, not only does it secrete hormones such as insulin and glucagon, the insulin which will decrease blood sugar, and glucagon which increases blood sugar, as well as a couple other hormones, but it also makes various enzymes. The hormonal portion is what we call the endocrine portion, because it takes the hormones, puts them in the blood, and the blood circulates it around. The exocrine portion, they make enzymes and put them out from the pancreas through a duct into the duodenum as well. Things like amylase, lipase, and other things that will assist in digestion. Now you see these commercials about exocrine pancreatic insufficiency. You know, if you have bloating, if you have gas and stuff like that, you may have exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, which basically is a deficiency of some of the enzymes that are coming out of the pancreas that decrease the ability to be able to digest. So that's what we have in regards to our accessory organs of digestion. Okay, and this is what we're talking about. We're looking at here. Here's just like a little diagram, and we'll be talking about these individually. We're going to start up, you know, if we look at where we start, obviously, hopefully this is working today. It wasn't working. It's not working again today. My pen, something happened to my touch screen and it's not working. But if we look at the top, we have the area with the nose and the mouth, and then the esophagus coming down, and then you see the liver in the right upper quadrant, which is the left upper side of the abdomen you see on the picture here, and the stomach below it. So the esophagus is going to dump things into the stomach, and the stomach is going to eliminate this out into the first portion of the small intestine, which is actually only about 9 to 12 inches long. It's called the duodenum, and it's just like a little C area. It's a little C area up in here. It comes around like a little C, and it's small but mighty. So the stomach holds things in by a sphincter at the top of the stomach and at the end of the stomach, and churns things up and uses acids and stuff like that. It has a little game where it plays all that stuff inside the stomach, and finally the sphincter that goes into the duodenum opens up and lets the food, well, hopefully you won't, I don't think you'd eat it at that point, but it helps the material that's in the stomach now go into the first portion of the small intestine. What gets squirted in there? That bile from the gallbladder, the pancreatic enzymes, and it helps to further break things down as it's going down the GI tract. Okay, so that's what we see in regards to some of these. Then what happens, it goes through the small intestine, goes through multiple areas. Like I say, the duodenum is only about this long, maybe 9, 12 inches long. And then the other maybe 20 feet, who cares how many feet, 19, 20, 20.2, I don't really care, it's long, okay? The rest of it goes, the next portion is called the jejunum. And the jejunum is still helping to prepare things in the first half. The second half, it's starting to absorb a little bit and finally get to the ileum, and the ileum is a large area where a lot of stuff is absorbed in the ileum. And then finally from the ileum, it gets dumped into the area of the large intestine. Now, if I look at this image right here, and again, I'm sorry because for some reason my touch screen is no longer working here. If I look down here, that's what attrition will do after all these PowerPoint videos. If you look down in the corner, which would be in the lower left corner of this image, which is actually this person's right lower quadrant, which everybody should know, that's where the large intestine starts. The ileum empties into there with another little sphincter. It's called the ileocecal valve or ileocecal sphincter. It dumps into a little pocket right down there, which is called the cecum. And at the bottom of the cecum, you see a little worm-like thing, and that's the area of the appendix. And then we go up the large intestine, up the colon, which is the ascending colon, across the colon, which is the transverse, then down the descending colon, and then we go through what's called the sigmoid colon to wrap around like an S-shaped curve to get everything in the middle, and then we get to the rectum where fecal material is stored, and then finally eliminated out through the anus. Okay, I just don't like the fact that this line here that's going to the anus is also pointing at my head. Okay, it doesn't mean anything, by the way, just to let you know. Okay. Well, what happens is when we look at the structure of the GI tract, it's very interesting, okay? And I don't want to go too much, and I'm probably not going to have a whole lot of big, things going in here. But if I look at the structure of the GI tract here, what happens is we see that it's multiple layers, okay? That inner layer of the GI tract, I don't know what happened here.